I'm the provost of the university, and I'd like to welcome you all to this event, What's at Stake? U.S. Rights and Responsibilities During Political Conflict. We are going to give you a lightning course in aspects of U.S. civil society delivered by some of our most distinguished faculty from the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences and the UConn School of Law, and we're going to do it fast. And so it's my pleasure to kick off the event by introducing Professor Bauer from the law school.
Okay, so I'm fully expecting to get the hook at some point since I'm told we have to go fast. So I have 1 minute left now. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about the executive orders that, as you all know, President Trump issued during his first week in office concerning immigration. The one that got the most attention was the so-called travel ban, restricting entry from a number of Muslim-majority countries. But and my colleague Bethany Berger will be talking some more about that. But I'd like to focus on two other immigration executive orders issued the same week, which are likely to have a really profound impact on how the U.S. treats its 11 million residents who lack legal status, but have built lives in this country, forged social and economic ties with their communities, and established families that include 4 million U.S. citizen children. At stake, and I forget the word at stake, given the title of this program, at stake is whether the U.S. lives up to the constitutional promises of equal protection and due process of law, which under the 5th and 14th Amendments to the Constitution are owed not just to citizens, but to any person within the United States. In 1982, in a case called Plyler against Doe, the Supreme Court struck down the Texas law that excluded unauthorized migrant children from the public schools, finding that the law violated the Equal Protection Clause. The court wrote, "The specter of a permanent caste of undocumented resident aliens, encouraged by some to remain here as a source of cheap labor, but nevertheless denied the benefits that our society makes available to citizens and lawful residents, creates an underclass and therefore runs counter to principles of equality under law." The court also emphasized that while undocumented children and their families may be subject to deportation under federal law, whether any particular individual will get deported or whether they might have a right to remain in the United States often can't be determined until deportation proceedings are completed. For that reason, too, the court considered it fundamentally unfair to treat undocumented people in this country as outsiders. A number of other decisions of the Supreme Court make it clear that the Constitution's Due Process Clause protects non-citizens in the U.S., even if they entered unlawfully, and it entitles them to proceedings conforming to traditional standards of fairness before they can be deported. So how does this all relate to the executive orders? Well, one of the most consequential changes made by the immigration executive orders is a massive expansion of a process called expedited removal. This allows immigration officials to quickly and summarily deport people without providing any kind of hearing or even the opportunity to consult with a lawyer. Until now, expedited removal had only been used for people who arrive at an airport or a border crossing station without valid papers, or people who are caught close to the border very shortly after they enter. But under the new executive orders, anyone who's caught anywhere in the U.S. Who can't show that they have authorization to be here is subject to expedited removal unless the person can convince an ICE agent that they've already been in the country for at least 2 years. This poses some really serious due process questions, and its constitutionality will be challenged in the courts. Without access to a lawyer and without a fair hearing in front of an immigration judge or another neutral decision maker, there's a really big risk that even people who may have a valid claim to remain in the U.S. will get kicked out of the country with no chance to have their claims heard. The executive orders also call for the increased use of detention while people are awaiting their removal proceedings. That too raises serious constitutional concerns. We already have a massive immigration detention system, which holds about 35,000 people every day and 400,000 people over the course of a year. They're held in prison-like conditions in county jails and in private detention facilities run by contractors like the GEO Group around the country. Prolonged pretrial detention under the Due Process Clause is only supposed to be used if there's an individualized determination that someone poses a danger to others or is a flight risk, unlikely to turn up at their hearing. The executive order, though, creates a strong presumption in favor of detaining people for as long as it takes to get them in front of an immigration judge or removed. And that is likely subject, might well be unconstitutional too. The executive orders also totally upend the government's enforcement priorities in immigration. In 2014, the Obama administration issued guidelines that recognize the reality that we can't realistically deport 11 million people. The Obama priorities, the Obama policies prioritized for removal people with serious criminal convictions and recent border crossings. People without criminal records who had been in the US for some time could go about their lives with some confidence that they'd be left alone. The new executive orders, though, totally upend those enforcement priorities. They are so broadly framed that virtually every undocumented person fits into an enforcement priority. What this will mean is who gets picked up in immigration raids is going to become much more random and unpredictable. This in itself might not be illegal or unconstitutional, but it fosters exactly the kinds of harms that the Supreme Court warned against in Filer against Doe. It creates an underclass forced to live in the shadows, constantly at risk of being taken into custody, and it puts their children, who are often US citizens, in an unstable and insecure situation, detrimental to their development and well-being. The new executive orders also have a big impact on the population that I mostly work with in the clinic that I run at the law school, asylum seekers. The tradition of this country as an asylum for the persecuted goes back to its beginnings. Tom Paine, in his Revolutionary War pamphlet, Common Sense, pitched the new nation as an asylum for mankind. And in one of his early presidential addresses, George Washington said the new nation stood ready to receive the persecuted and oppressed of all nations. We haven't always lived up to that ideal. In the 1930s, we turned away Jews who were fleeing persecution in Nazi Germany, largely because they were viewed by many here as security threats, which is a kind of rhetoric that will probably sound familiar to you. That kind of rhetoric can be found throughout the executive orders. You can see it in the travel ban, which suspends the refugee program and shows a strong hostility towards refugees and asylum seekers. It's also going to play out with the increased use of expedited removal, which is going to make it harder for people with asylum claims to bring those claims forward. So I am getting the hook. Let me stop there and turn things over to my help. Thank you.
So our next speaker is Bethany Berger, who's a well-esteemed professor of law.
Yeah, and I actually didn't plan this, but I'm a law-esteemed professor, and I've got 2 poems in my presentation. One, the first by Martin E. Muller, about how oppression affects all of us. And so what I'm going to do, differently from John, is say that this is a story not so much of disjuncture, but continuity, and talk about the ways that this affects all of us. And so we might imagine immigration restrictions happening more on planes or perhaps on ships, but they happen on Amtrak too. This is Pascal Amador, a U.S. citizen, non-Muslim, who was traveling from Montreal by train back to his home in Cambridge. During a routine stop, border officials seized his computer, searched through it, found out personal stuff about himself and his girlfriend, detained him for several hours, released him but not the computer until the ACLU got involved. And federal district court later held that was just fine. They don't need reasonable suspicion at the border to seize and search your electronic equipment. And what else is included in electronic equipment? All you have on you at this time, your cell phones. And that didn't happen under the Trump administration. That happened under the Obama administration. And that was not a new principle of law, that was building on the old principle of law. So how did we get here? So we didn't have immigration restrictions for about our first 100 years. We needed immigrants to settle this country. We pictured ourselves, as John said, as a nation of many nations. And also, the Congress didn't really want to mess with travel restrictions when the question of travel between slave states and free states was so controversial. But with the end of the Civil War, Congress was ready to get into the immigration business. And who did it start with? It started with Chinese. Much like the restrictions today, the first restriction focused directly on nationals from another country with a different religion, a different race. So between 1882 and 1943, federal law prohibited any Chinese national besides a student or merchant from entering the United States, and people celebrated. So although this was restricted on Chinese for a while, it wasn't for long. And the Supreme Court said, this is okay, this is constitutional, and approved the growth of the vast administrative machinery that John talked about today, that's 35,000 people in detention at any time. In addition, they expanded the targets of immigration. So they focused on the poor, looking at Irish immigrants in particular. They focused on women that they thought were going to be likely to become prostitutes, scrutinizing here Japanese brides going to meet their husband. They also focused on political radicals, targeting the labor movement of the early 20th century. And the Supreme Court kept upholding this. 1924, the racial ban increased to bar anybody from a barred Asiatic zone, which included not just Japan, not just India, but most of the Middle East, all of Polynesia. Same year, they placed restrictions on European migrants, saying they could only come in proportion to the numbers in which you were already here. That was particularly intended to limit the flow of kind of off-white Europeans, particularly Eastern European Jews and Italians. So my grandfather came here before the 1924 restriction legally. My grandmother came illegally after it, and left with my father when he was 7 years old to spend a year in Canada until they could re-enter the country legally to avoid being deported at the time the Holocaust was building up. Again, the courts are upholding all of this. So we might have a chance to do better this time. When the initial immigration ban was enacted, people flooded that afternoon airport. So this is JFK. And they were saying, not this time. We are not going here again. Volunteer lawyers, like the ones that John trains in his asylum and refugee clinic, showed up and camped out to make sure that everybody got representation. And the courts this time responded well. They said, this looks like a religious ban, this looks like a violation of due process. We've got a new ban out today, it's not much different, but it's got some more bells and whistles on it. We'll see what the courts do with that. But because of that discretion that we allowed and courts approved, folks can be treated at the border, can be detained with very little rights. So on top is Daniela Vargas, a 22-year-old math student who had DACA deferred action status, was renewing her deferred action status, spoke at a press conference protesting against the immigration ban, and was detained later that afternoon for deportation. She probably has few legal claims to make because some, John would probably say a lot, but not that many, given what we've proved. This is Sarah Brumahan, who back in 2010, she and her family was returning from a wedding. She's a citizen of the United States, returning from a wedding in Toronto. All of them were detained for hours and hours in a cold room with children until they were finally released, and she's got little recourse. So I want to make you think, this is affecting all of us, citizens, non-citizens. And what we approve now is going to affect us in the future. So with that, an adorable picture of my nephew Isaac at JFK with a hastily constructed sign by my sister, and thank you very much.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Professor Kent Newmeyer, who's a professor of law and emeritus professor of history. That's you.
You know, I was going to talk about Trump and Andrew Jackson, but I realized I'd be doing a disservice to Andrew Jackson. So actually, I'm going to talk about the protest movement because I have a feeling that some of you folks might be interested in protest. So I'm a historian, so I'll put a little historical spin on that. I might start out by quoting Oliver Wendell Holmes, famous justice of the Supreme Court. He met some Yeah, he met some Austin people over in Boston in 1897. He said, you know, what you got to do is get that dragon out of the cage and count its teeth. Well, it seems to me the dragon is out of the cave, and there are a lot of teeth to count. So I'm thinking here, for a president to make the office into his own personal image, you know, to solve his own psychic needs, I mean, that's a serious problem for office. Then there's a damage that's done to our institutions of government by somebody who's just ignorant of how the system works, so that people have no faith in them, which may be a serious problem. Maybe that's what's intended. There is a racial hatred unleashed on the world's biggest bully pulpit, for sure. And that is, as you know, the big lie, the little lie, the intellectual assault on rationality and learning, on the very idea of free inquiry as a way to find objective truth. I mean, those are all serious problems. All of these things are linked, you might realize, to a revolution in communication. We don't have the Nuremberg rounds, like those staged by Leni Riefenstahl with starring Hitler. We now have a Maximo reader, hooted on by Stephen Bannon, tweeting directly into your bedroom around the clock. Hey, I'm saying stuff you already know, and you already know, I suppose, that much of this stuff is not new in American history, sad to say. Racism, of course, has abounded in our country from the very start. In the first part of the 19th century, it was the Germans. Then in the 1840s and 50s, it was the Irish. After the Civil War, it was the Italians. And as Bethany pointed out, it was the Chinese. And then the Jews, the anti-Catholics, always the Indians, always the Americans. Now it's anti-Muslim, anti-Mexican. And above all, of course, there are 250 years of racial slavery. The idea that people with black skins were assumed to be slaves. And after that ended, slavery ended, but the racism stayed on. And we always seem in this country to have a lot of hate. And all these hate movements, I have to say, were accompanied by irrational, fear-mongering, conspiracy-laden pseudo-scientific, lying in the faith propaganda. So I guess what I'm saying is what's happening now is not all that new. Well, hey, but there's another tradition. I think this is relevant to maybe what you folks not having in mind. And that tradition has to do with protest, dissent, civil disobedience, and the fight for justice. And I have to say this tradition has often been overlooked in American history. For a long time, it wasn't recognized in the textbooks or even in the classroom. But, and of course, if you protested, as you know, you were going to be branded by people like, Joe McCarthy or Steve Bannon as being un-American. Radicals have been branded as enemies of the law, as liberal do-gooders, eggheads, pinkos, communists, anarchists, terrorists, or just plain intellectuals. So, in order to eradicate enemies of the people, it's a scary totalitarian proposition right there. It's argued that it's okay to, violate First Amendment rights to isolate these people and drive them out. Bannon wants to put protests beyond the law, along with the First Amendment. Well, the point of all this is, so be forewarned. If you guys pick up a picket sign, you march to Washington, you're likely to be branded as an enemy of the people, as un-American. So, my point is there's another tradition, a radical protest tradition in this country. And our nation was born in protest, as you know. Anti-Federalists protested against the Federalists to get the Bill of Rights. 30 years of radical protest by the abolitionists brought down 250 years of racial slavery. The protest movement cost them a great deal. They were branded as un-American anarchists too. And of course they organized. They voted Lincoln in 1860. Lincoln caused a civil war. The Civil War caused a new constitution, one without slavery. So radical protest is a part of our tradition. It has its background in labor history, women's rights, gay rights, all those like that. But again, you probably know that. But there's another lesson here. Protest in this country has been unusual because people haven't protested in this country to overturn the government or overturn the Constitution. The protests have always been a fight to get a piece of the constitutional action. And that makes us unique. Well, here are a few takeaways from this. There are many ways to protest, as you know. Maybe just arm yourself with information about how your government works. Take a course with Professor Yalow. That's a good place to start. Take Professor Berger's course if you want to find out how our government has not worked. She teaches a course in Indian law at the law school. But even when you take to the streets, remember that you have American history on your side, and don't let anybody tell you different. Protest tradition, I say, is American as cherry pie. Another thing, keep your eye on the prize. The prize is to make the Constitution and the Bill of Rights work for you for justice. And the greatest challenge, I think, if you protest, in the act of protesting, let's don't turn into what we hate. Let's listen to the other side. Let's respect the First Amendment. Let's don't condemn. Let's convert. Let's peel a few of them off. I think that's the thing to do. And finally, I think, remember that rational discourse, inquiry, freedom of speech, belief in objective knowledge is what we do here at the university. Hey, it's our line of work. So, you guys, you might have to circle the wagons. Just remember that's your obligation to do it. And finally, I guess I would like you to consider what Ralph Waldo Emerson once said. Hey, if you go out and do this stuff, you know what you got to do? Get yourself a couple of heroes. Get yourself 2 or 3 heroes. And he said, if you choose the right ones, you don't have to choose very many. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Douglas Spencer, who is a professor of law and public policy.
All right, I'm going to change gears a little bit and talk about voting rights. In particular, thinking about what voting rights are what kind of voting rights are at stake, and how things have changed or are different now that President Trump lives in the White House and has a lot of power over who will enforce our voting rights, who will sit on the Supreme Court and decide what kinds of protections will be enforced or what kinds of restrictions will be tolerated. So first of all, I just want to point out there are two different major threats to voting rights. One is what we call vote dilution. This is where you take people's votes, and it generally happens through redistricting and gerrymandering, and you can maximize the power of your own party if you draw lines in a particular way. You can minimize the power of another group. Maybe it's a different political party, maybe it's another racial minority group, and in that way, by drawing lines in a particular way after each census, you can dilute the voting strength of entire groups of citizens. That's one major threat to voting rights. The second threat to voting rights is what we call vote denial. Vote denial are barriers that we put in front of citizens who want to vote, either preventing them to vote or making it difficult for them to vote. A long time ago, these vote denial laws were written very clearly in statutes. We bar women from voting. We bar African Americans from voting. Once the voting right was extended to females, African Americans, 18-year-olds, to where we get almost what looks like universal adult suffrage, we have new forms of vote denial laws. Literacy tests, poll taxes, now we see things like voter ID laws, rollbacks in early voting, etc. So each of these types of threats is at play. Both of them are at stake right now. There are both partisan and racial gerrymandering claims that have been tried at the lower courts, found unconstitutional, and have been applied to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court is currently waiting to decide whether they'll take those cases. They have 8 justices. They may be waiting to get a 9th so that they have a chance to get a particular outcome. We don't know. But that's something that will happen. The Supreme Court will make that decision by the end of this term in May. There are also developments around the country in terms of state legislatures passing laws, enacting voter ID laws. Some of them are very strict. You can only vote if you can show a photo identification that was issued by your local government that hasn't expired. Some of them are less strict. They allow you to show many forms of ID to prove that you are who you say you are. And there are other rules that are being enacted. In North Carolina, we've seen the expansion of early voting over many years, and now that early voting is being taken away, but in a strategic way. Not minimizing the number of days before an election to just 4 before the election, but excluding weekends, where we know African Americans have used weekend early voting explicitly through church programs in Florida and North Carolina. So in ways that look sketchy, to say the least. Now there's 2 developments that have happened since January 20th. First, Donald Trump tweeted that 3 to 5 million people voted illegally. Secondly, just this past week, the Department of Justice announced that it would be switching sides, essentially. It would be dropping out of a lawsuit in Texas for one of its claims, which really is a signal to many people who are watching this that in the future, the Department of Justice won't be suing states for passing discriminatory laws. They'll be defending those states if civil rights groups sue them and claim that they've been discriminatory. And both of those developments will have a serious impact and will change the way that our voting rights are either protected or restrictions are tolerated in the future. Now the truth is, the elections in all of the states are running very smoothly. Many people thought that November 2016 would be an election that had all kinds of problems and long lines and protests and people would be there with guns. And there are people who threatened, I'll show up with my truck and I have a cage in the back and I'm going to find people who don't look right and I'm going to put them in my own jail. And all these kinds of threats that didn't really materialize. Secretaries of state around the country have met and said the election ran smoothly. And really what's going on is all this drama that's coming out of Washington, D.C. President Trump's tweets, the new developments by the Department of Justice, and conversations undermining the work that our secretaries of state and our registrars of voters are engaged in. All right. I think that these developments will have 2 particular outcomes that we'll see. One, more states will be empowered to pass voter restriction laws, like voter ID laws. One of those reasons is because those laws are often said to be motivated by fears about voter fraud. And President Trump has planted this seed that 3 to 5 million people might be out there who are illegal and voting. which just isn't true, or at least the evidence that we have comes very far away from 3 to 5 million people voting against the rules. We have found since in the 2016 race, where we think somebody might have violated the law. We're not sure yet. We're just going to investigate those 55 cases. My guess is we'll end up with about 20 people who violated the law in some way, thought they were allowed to vote, maybe they on purpose voted in 2 places, and they'll be punished accordingly. But that's not 3 million, that's not 5 million, that's not even 100. But with the seed planted that there might be fraud, states will be empowered to pass these voter restriction laws, also knowing that the Department of Justice won't sue them. In fact, the Department of Justice might put forth its resources to defend them. So I think we'll see more laws coming out that restrict the right to vote. I also think that it's possible we may see the Department of Justice asking local attorneys, U.S. attorneys, to find voter fraud and to prosecute it more vigorously. And here we could take a lesson from history, and not even a long time ago history, 10 years ago history. Everyone in this room who's not very old was alive 10 years ago should remember that under the Bush administration, the Department of Justice asked U.S. attorneys to vigorously prosecute voter fraud. The U.S. attorney says, we're trying, we don't find any, and 8 of those U.S. attorneys were fired, which became a scandal large enough that the Attorney General had to step down. So maybe this is another development we'll repeat ourselves 10 years later. All right, thinking about voting rights in the future, I'll leave you with three takeaways, 3 things for your mind, and I'll sit down. 2 of them are more practical, and 1 of them is more theoretical. So the first practical thing I want you to think about when you see a voter ID law or a voting restriction law on the books or proposed by a state, I want you to see whether or not that law steals it from their mailbox. Someone goes to the old folks' home, but there's 300 of them delivered on that day, and takes all of them. So if we're really motivated by fraud, and you see people passing laws that will restrict you from showing up, but says nothing about absentee ballots, something's fishy. So that's one key that you can look at when you see these laws. Look whether there's any restrictions or any rules about absentee ballots. The second I want to say is that policymakers can evaluate voter ID laws in a vacuum, which is to say they don't have to worry about history. They can be agnostic about the history. Is this law good or bad? It's a cost-benefit analysis. Lawyers can't do that. Lawyers have to make arguments that are couched in historical cases to prove why current conditions are different than the past. So it matters what has been going on in our country for the last 20 and 30 years, and if you see your policymaker saying it doesn't matter, that's their constraints, but if they're challenged in courts, all the history in our country will matter, so we'll have to pay attention to that. We can't ignore history. Finally, the last theoretical point I'll make is this. In criminal law, we have consensus as a society that we would prefer innocent people to not go to prison. And it's okay for somebody who's guilty to be left out of prison so that an innocent person doesn't get stuck in prison. That's a value that we have accepted, and we have lots of rules around that. We don't have the same kind of conception about voting rights. Is it better if we prevent all fraudulent votes from ever being cast, if it means that some people who should be able to vote are left out? Or is it better that we encourage anybody who could possibly vote, encourage them to get out and exercise their civic duty, recognizing that if the law is a little bit looser, some fraudulent votes might get in? There's no answer to that question yet, but it's a debate that we should be having that hasn't happened yet. So I'm encouraging you to at least think about that in your mind and have that debate among yourselves. Thank you.
Thanks. Our final speaker for this portion of the program is David Yellow, who is the head of the Political Science Department.
So I want to start by reading from a different constitution, not the Constitution of our own. This is Chapter 7, Article 50 of the Different Nations Constitution. In accordance with the interests of the people, citizens are guaranteed freedom of speech, freedom of the press, of assembly, meetings, street processions, and demonstrations. Exercise of these freedoms is ensured by putting public buildings, streets, and squares at the disposal of citizens and by broad dissemination of information and by the opportunity to use the press, television, and radio. That is Chapter 7, Article 50 of the Constitution of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, passed and ratified by the original Soviet group in 1917, amended in 1977. Obviously, as the USSR's constitution, those particular provisions were not even worth the paper they were written in. They were just words. We love the Bill of Rights. We cherish the Bill of Rights. But in the end, having a Bill of Rights doesn't get you far. without the judiciary, and without the bulwark of a judiciary standing up against dictatorship. And all of my colleagues who've already spoken to you have talked a lot about the judiciary. They've talked a lot about the courts. I want to kind of try to tie this part of tonight together by discussing not just the next justice. We know who the next justice will probably be, Neil Gorsuch. In some ways, the choice of Neil Gorsuch, a very distinguished U.S. Court of Appeals judge, is one of the most normal things Donald Trump has done. I think most of us believe that if Marco Rubio had become the President of the United States, or Ted Cruz, or any of the other nominees, any of the other Republican candidates, they probably would have chosen somebody pretty much like Neil Gorsuch, and he probably will be confirmed. But what I want to talk to you about in this short time is about the judiciary and the nature of judiciary, because I think to some extent, and we're beginning to see some of this, some of the scariest aspects of the last 47 days since January 20th have been about comments and threats to the judiciary. Now, some of it obviously predates Donald Trump being inaugurated as president. A lot of it comes from things that we heard in the campaign. I think a lot of people forget that when the Republican primaries were kind of raging about a year ago, several of the Republican nominees, including Donald Trump, spoke very negatively about John Roberts. They referred to John Roberts, I think Trump's words were, as a failed justice, a big problem, something we've got to... Now this is Chief Justice John Roberts, an appointee of George W. Bush, who in 99% of the cases is probably one of the more conservative justices in American history. But they talked about the one case they didn't like by him, and that was the case that upheld Obamacare as constitutional in 2012. But calling out the Chief Justice, especially a Chief Justice who is so often quite conservative, was very unusual, not precedented. And an important part of the beginning of this criticism of the judiciary. Then we remember during the campaign, we remember Donald Trump specifically calling out U.S. District Judge Gonzales-Curiel as being biased against his lawsuit dealing with Trump University. A U.S. District Judge from San Diego, born in Indiana, criticized as being against him because of his Hispanic origins. And no less Speaker of the House, Paul Ryan, specifically said that was the textbook definition of racism. And that was just before Donald Trump became president. Obviously, since Donald Trump's become president, there have been several more moments of criticism of the judiciary, which is quite unprecedented in American history by sitting presidents. Even presidents like FDR, who was very frustrated with the judiciary, but not necessarily calling them out by name. We saw him refer to the judge who struck down the ban that one of my colleagues mentioned as the so-called judge. And this got a lot of attention. So much attention, by the way, that Neil Gorsuch's own nominee said he found that demoralizing and disheartening. And we've also seen other tweets that refer to the judiciary as being nakedly political and a big problem that we have to do something about. All of this is something we have to take very seriously because all of my colleagues referring to the judiciary, there's a running assumption that the judiciary itself will be respected enough and adhered to enough that it will protect us in a way that the judiciary was unavailable to protect the rights that I read to you from the USSR Constitution. So looking at the possible dangers of a judiciary that is discredited, in a very subtle but not easy to notice way, when you begin to beat up the judiciary, you put all of these rights at threat. And there are at least 3 keys to keeping a judiciary strong enough so they can serve as a bulwark against dictatorship. Some of this is from a colleague of mine, Kirk Randazzo from the University of South Carolina, but others have made this point as well. 3 points. First, public acceptance and public support for the judiciary. It's critical. The judiciary cannot survive long without the public standing behind it and offering a certain level of support. Watch that. Watch how the judiciary fares in polls. See if Donald Trump's discrediting of the judiciary begins to actually affect people's views of the judiciary. That's going to be an important moment, obviously. Political elites in American history have stood by the judiciary even when the president or individuals have been frustrated by the judiciary. And Neil Gorsuch, to some extent, is a political elite, and he stood by the judiciary even when the person who appointed him discredited it. And finally, the presence of political competition that the judiciary can protect. I think we all remember that very scary moment in one of the presidential debates when Donald Trump said, if I win, I will put you, Hillary Clinton, in jail. And the fear that that's what our political opponents are now going to suffer from. Political competition joined with a judiciary willing to protect it is an important part of a free government and an important part of the judiciary staying there. But I think what I want to do in concluding is kind of talk about the importance of the judiciary not compromising. Watch that. The judiciary is not supposed to accept violations of the law in hopes of getting something later. It has to stand firm. And I have, from the beginning of this administration, kind of really not enjoyed any kinds of comparisons to Nazi Germany and Hitler. I think those can often backlash. I think they can often do discredit to honest arguments against Donald Trump, if that is where people stand. But I do want to leave you with a quote from Judgment at Nuremberg, a 1962 movie, which is before most of us in here were born. But in that particular movie, Nazi judges had fallen on the job. They had basically done the work that Hitler needed them to do, and they were now being subject to international tribunals and international law. And Burt Lancaster, playing one of those Nazi judges, looked at the American judge who was judging him and said, "You must believe me. I never thought it would come to this. I never thought hundreds, thousands, millions would die. It never was supposed to come to that." And Spencer Tracy looked right back at him and said, "Judge, it came to that the first time you sentenced someone you knew who was innocent to jail. The first time you do that, just once, that's when it came to that." And that's the bulwark against dictatorship that we have to watch most carefully, and I think my colleagues pointed that out quite nicely. Thank you.
I want to take a very quick 5-minute break to regroup. Questions back on this first door, down the left, down the main hallway.
Hi, I'm Davida Sylvan Glassberg. I'm the Dean of the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences. And I would like to introduce first Maureen Coteau, who is the head of the Department of Journalism.
Thank you all of you who stayed here. I'm delighted to see you. Thank you for coming here to begin with. I'm here because I'm a journalist, and I need to say to you that I'm here because I'm a real journalist, not a fake journalist, not an alternate news journalist, nothing like that, a real one. So I don't believe in alternate facts, and I don't believe in fake news, but I do believe in facts and lies, news and propaganda. And I believe that sometimes one masquerades as the other. And when that happens, I believe there's always a motive. I also believe that we're incredibly fortunate to have the First Amendment, but that as a country we take it for granted. There was a recent national survey, and only 30% of adult Americans could identify even one of the 5 rights guaranteed by the First Amendment. So let's take a look at it. 45 words. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, number 1, or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech, number 2, or of the press, number 3, or the right of the people peaceably to assemble, number 4, and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. 45 magnificent words. These words were incredible. There isn't even a word big enough for how important they were when they were written in 1791, or when they were ratified in 1791, but they are just as incredible today. So if we take this for granted, we are forgetting something that is peculiarly, that is ours. Peculiarly ours, okay. Only 13% of the population of the United States, of the world, lives in a country with freedom, complete freedom of speech and press, comparable to what we have here. So, fairly unfettered. If you looked at 13% in this room, it would be the first 4 rows of chairs here. Everyone else in this room would have either limited freedom or none at all. 46%, nearly half, would have none at all. So it's important to remember that we are the exception to the rule in the United States. We are not the rule. And that's why there are 259 journalists now in prison around the world, because they don't have the same protections that we have. Of those, 81 are in Turkey alone. So what does that mean? Well, it means that one of those, Atis Duman, was accused of being in league with a banned political party, and she began her life sentence in 2003 when she was 29 years old. She's still there and has no real hope of getting out at any point soon. So it's important to remember that what we have in the First Amendment is very powerful, but it is also very fragile. 7 years after the First Amendment was ratified, Congress passed the Alien and Sedition Acts limiting the freedom of speech and the press. 7 years later. One of the people arrested was Benjamin Franklin's grandson, Benjamin Franklin Bosch. He had inherited his grandfather's printing press. As it turned out, he died at age 29 of yellow fever before his trial. But chances are good he would have gone to prison, because those laws stayed in effect until 1801, when the new president, Thomas Jefferson, pardoned all of those charged under the Sedition Act, and Congress reimbursed everyone who had been fined. So you would think that we as a country would have learned from that, and you'd say, well, we did that once, we will never do that again. And we didn't, until 1918, when Congress passed the same kind of legislation. This time, one of those arrested was a fellow named Eugene Debs, a pacifist, a socialist labor leader, and his crime was delivering an anti-war speech in Canton, Ohio, for which he was sentenced to 20 years in prison. The Supreme Court considered his case and affirmed it. He served 3 years in prison until the law was repealed and he was granted a presidential pardon. Those things happened in these United States with the First Amendment in place. Outside of our own country, history shows us that the first act of a totalitarian regime is to control what the people can know or say. The Ugandan dictator Idi Amin said, "There is freedom of speech, but I cannot guarantee freedom after speech." One of Hitler's first acts was to establish the Ministry of Propaganda under Joseph Goebbels. The ministry first made sure that all journalists were racially pure by their standards, and then they told them what to say. Stalin, Mao, Papa Dr. Valier, all of them controlled freedom of speech and the press. It was essential, it is essential to being a dictator. I want to be absolutely clear that what is going on today, I am not comparing I'm not comparing what is happening in our country at this moment to those tyrannies. But I want to make it clear to you that there have been times in our history when we have had the First Amendment and it has meant very little or nothing, and that we have to continue to exercise the First Amendment if we are to continue to have it. If there is only one thing that you remember that I say here today, it is this: freedom of the press is not about just the press. It is about you. So when someone tries to shut down or limit or silence the press, we have to remember that the intent is to shut out, limit, and silence you. What can you do? 3 things. Well, not that. I'm a very sensitive clicker, I guess. I have trouble with it. What can you do? 3 things. First, you can use your education to separate propaganda from news. You can consider who's supplying the information and the intent. You can use the power of truth to refute false claims, not pass them along unvetted in social media. We who have the privilege of an education have a duty to use it in that way. 2, you can support the real press by paying for their expertise. Buy a newspaper. Subscribe to a trusted online news provider. Real journalism is expensive. Trained professionals who are trained to question authority, to verify sources, and to follow the ethical guidelines of our profession. Fake news, which requires none of that, is a lot cheaper, and it's worth every cent. Number 3, you can call a lie when you see it. You can speak up. The First Amendment gives you that. Facts do matter. Knowing how our government works and who our leaders are and to whom they owe favors or money matters. And when anyone, local, state, or national official, religious leader, industrialist, or teacher attempts to limit your right to speak or to hear the truth, you can say, hell no. I've got the First Amendment and I intend to use it. If any of you would like a copy of the First Amendment, I have marks on it for you. Thank you.
Thank you, Maureen. Our next speaker is Melina Papadimos. She's a professor of history. She's the director of Africana Studies.
Thank you. Thank you again for those who are still here. I'm going to talk about a story both personal and universal, and about a story that is rooted in historical evidence. I'm a historian. And it's about political climate and how easily it can change, as well as how it can be controlled. On August 18, 1955, having been summoned by the House Congressional Committee on Un-American Activities, or HUAC, singer-songwriter Pete Seeger sat in a federal courtroom in Lower Manhattan, staring down a panel of HUAC inquisitors, including Committee Chairman Francis Walter, Member Gordon Schur, Chief Counsel Frank Kavanaugh. Seeger was subpoenaed because he had previously, quote, lent his talent, unquote, to the Communist Party. Indeed, the party's mouthpiece, the Daily Worker, advertised his performances at recent fundraisers and rallies. For HUAC, this information made Seeger either a communist or a sympathizer who used his considerable musical talent to support the party, something HUAC committee members believed was a major threat to national security. It was, after all, the 1950s, the era of McCarthyism, named for the Manichaean Senator Joseph McCarthy. Authoritarianism mushroomed then. U.S. citizens were by the thousands accused of subversion or treason. Military researchers were themselves spied on, and the Red Peril was the watchword of the day. Most of us look on this period as a political nadir, a nightmarish cannibalism of select congressmen perpetuated against U.S. citizens that produced the red and homophobic lavender scares, put alleged communists and sympathizers out of jobs and on the streets, pushed motion picture execs to blacklist the Hollywood 10, and and neutralized and gagged civil rights groups and individual activists. Often termed a witch hunt, McCarthyism roots are deeply embedded, as my colleague Professor Neumeyer outlined, in social movements and conservative backlash in this country. Things like the Ghost Movement, Wounded Knee, Sitting Bull at Standing Rock, Slave Rebellion, Reconstruction, the KKK, tenement and feminist activism, and exclusion acts through which the federal government persecuted Asian, Arab, and other cultural, ethnic, and racial minority groups. As Tavener and Scher questioned Seeger, a musician, by the way, famous for such subversive songs as Where Have All the Flowers Gone, Little Boxes, and This Land Is Your Land, he asserted his right to artistic freedom without persecution. He said, quote, "I love my country very dearly, and I greatly resent this implication that some of the places that I have sung, and some of the people that I have known, and some of my opinions, whether they are religious or philosophical, or I might be a vegetarian, make me any less American. I will tell you about my songs, but I'm not interested in telling you who wrote them, and I will tell you about my songs, but I am not interested in who listened to them." And though sentenced to 10 years, Seeger appealed and never served that time. A year later, in 1956, the year 96 congressman signed the Southern Manifesto that condemned the Supreme Court's 1954 Brown v. Board of Education desegregation ruling, calling it a clear abuse of judicial power and encouraging states' rights groups to challenge this federal ruling. A 23-year-old woman was summoned by the Missouri branch of HUAC. She sat in her courtroom in downtown St. Louis in front of HUAC members Frank Tavener, Gordon Shearer, and the Missouri Senator Morgan Mulder. After picketing the local Sears Roebuck, whose policy it was to not hire black clerks, and challenging police violence against the city's black children, as well as working with the Negro Labor Council to improve blacks' working conditions, she stood accused of the Big C, or communism. Her case caught my eye when I discovered that this woman was my mother. Time does limit me to a very brief read from her transcribed interrogation. I hope, though, that what I share now reveals where HUAC stood on autonomous choice in people's lives. Mr. Scher, Mrs. Papademos, who helped you prepare this scurrilous pamphlet? Mrs. Papademos, I will talk about the contents of the pamphlet, but I refuse to answer your question under the privilege provided me by the Fifth Amendment. Mr. Scher, did your husband help you prepare it? Mrs. Papademos, sir, I would not testify against my husband. Mr. Scher, you made a vicious and violent attack upon this HUAC committee. We are used to this from communists all over the country, but you particularly made an attack upon the Missouri chairman of this subcommittee with reference to the civil rights issue as it concerns Negroes. Is this pamphlet issued for the sole purpose of making it appear that the HUAC committee was attacking Negroes? Mrs. Papademos, sir, if you would examine that pamphlet closely, you would see it is merely stating that there are some activities besides those of the Negro Labor Council that the chairman could be investigating that really are un-American. I asked my mother, and she said that there was a resurgence of the KKK following that Brown v. Board of Education ruling. Mr. Tavener, may I ask you, were you a member of the Communist Party at any time during 1951? Mrs. Papademos, I reassert my privilege under the Fifth Amendment. Mr. Tavener, were you a member of the Communist Party at any time in 1952? Mrs. Papademos, the answer is no. Mr. Tavener, were you a member of the Communist Party at any time in 1953? Mrs. Papademos, the answer is no. Mr. Tavener, were you a member of the Communist Party at any time in 1954? Mrs. Papademos, the answer is no. Mr. Tavener, were you a member of the Communist Party at any time in 1955? Mrs. Papademos, the answer is still no. Are you a member of any group of the Communist Party at this time? Mrs. Papademos, I refuse to answer that question under the Fifth Amendment. Mr. Tavener, I have no further questions, Mr. Chairman. The irony is that at the time my mother was too young to join the Communist Party, which the HUAC interrogators, who had all of her information, should have known. Yet, despite my serendipitous discovery of this transcription, I can't by osmosis know what was the tenor of daily life in the U.S. with the HUAC machine at its apex. But political tides do change. Were we to revive McCarthyism today, as Newt Gingrich called for last summer, we might easily find ourselves in a time when parents forbid their children to play with the children of suspected communists. When being subpoenaed by HUAC or other government controls provoke job loss among thousands like my mother, when when active repudiations of poor wages or police violence are labeled subversive, and when social discourse is punished. Knowing the large-scale destructive effects of violence, antisocial tactics, such as those unleashed by 1950s McCarthyism, and witnessing now the revival of such Manichaean ideals and tactics in our political arena, what's at stake for us all is the erosion of political participation and muddying of meaningful public debate. What's at stake are attacks against children and parent bonding, mental health, immigrants, non-whites, and women of all colors. In other words, the stakes are the veracity of any government commitment to any vulnerable segment of our society. What's at stake is our very ability to control the component segments of our quality of life and ensure our basic emotional and health and social economic security. As a historian, I'll end by suggesting that we owe our future not to a linear narrative, but to the concentric agendas of our collective health and well-being and our right to political participation. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Kathy Schwinn-Biles. She's a professor of history and the director of Asian and Asian American Studies.
Hello, can everybody hear me? Thank you so much for staying. I actually want to echo a train of thought that's kind of going through all the panels, or all the presentations, which is that there's certainly politics involved, but there's also personal engagement. And I actually want to begin this story in a personal way. I would encourage you to think about the families who were affected by this history. And I also want to conclude with a more hopeful note. That incidentally features Wilbur Cross, the place that you probably know as an awful site of financial aid in the bursar's office. Okay, but hopefully this will all come together. And many of you probably already know about the Japanese-American internment, which is also known as Japanese-American incarceration, but I'm just going to briefly rehearse the history. And one of the things I really want to stress is that oftentimes internment is read as a cause and effect, and you kind of see this reiterated with regard to the contemporary war on terror. We are in a time of crisis, therefore we need to actually contain enemies within. But as Bethany pointed out, there has been a long history of anti-Asian exclusion by way of immigration and also by way of denaturalization. So a fact that we oftentimes don't remember is that it wasn't until 1943 that Chinese immigrants could get naturalized citizenship, and it was not until 1952 that naturalized citizenship was afforded to anybody regardless of race. So that's pretty late in the game. But to just quickly rehearse the history, on December 7th, 1941, the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor, which is in Hawaii. Soon after, the government, by way of the FBI, started gathering individuals they deemed suspicious, or like they deemed possible enemies of the state, particularly fishermen on the West Coast. And so fathers were rounded up. And the ways in which these individuals were rounded up was that, say the FBI would go into a Buddhist temple, get the list of names of people who had attended that temple, and then kind of seek out the fathers. And so that was kind of the first wave of surveillance. Then on February 19, 1942, President Franklin D. Roosevelt issues Executive Order 9066, which paves the way for the forced relocation and evacuation of 110,000 Japanese and Japanese Americans on the West Coast. It is important to note that even though Pearl Harbor is in Hawaii, not one Japanese American in Hawaii was interned. And the question is why, and the answer is, had those individuals been interned, then the economy of Hawaii, which was very much reliant on a plantation economy, would have collapsed. So that kind of tells you something about the threat. Another thing to remember about the story of internment is that prior to December 7th, 1941, in fact on November 7th, 1941, C.B. Munson, who had worked with the U.S. Army, had issued a report that stressed that Japanese Americans living on the West Coast pose no threats to the state. And it's important to note that of the 110,000 individuals of Japanese descent who were forcibly relocated, 2/3 were American citizens. And I want you to kind of envision, these are individuals largely your age, probably around 15 to 25. All right, so that's the population that is being interned. I want you to think about what that must have been like. Say you're a junior, you're trying to finish your engineering degree, and now you're forced to leave the University of California, Berkeley, and go into a relocation camp. So people's lives were tragically and dramatically interrupted. So the period of internment lasted from 1942 to 1946, and as a way of stomping on everybody's childhood dream, I have shown you a political cartoon drawn by none other than Dr. Seuss. And the cartoon says, waiting for the signal from home, honorable fifth column, and what you see are caricatures of Japanese subjects who are receiving TNT or bombs, right? And then you can kind of see California, Oregon, and Washington. So that kind of shows you how ubiquitous anti-Japanese sentiment was. And part of the reason why so many people at the time supported internment was precisely because very few people encountered Japanese or Japanese Americans, right? And we can kind of see an analog to the present, where even though Muslim Americans constitute roughly 28% of the population, there is a sense that like they are everywhere, right? So this is similar to what's happening with Japanese Americans. Japanese Americans, by and large, did not protest their internment, although there are Supreme Court cases that really kind of highlight there was resistance in the camps, and I'd be more than happy to talk about that during the Q&A. But it's important to note that the 442nd is the most decorated military battalion in military history, and that was the Japanese American Battalion. So I know that this kind of dates me, but if you've ever seen the original Karate Kid, released in 1984, Mr. Miyagi was in fact a member of the 442nd, and that's actually how I learned about internment, which highlights the sad state of Texas education. All right, so, Executive Order 9066 actually is in play. It never listed or mentioned a specific ethnicity or nationality, but it is actually in play until 1976, when Gerald Ford kind of removes it from the legislative books. So, it's not until 1988 that Japanese Americans get their redress movement resolved. And in 1988, Ronald Reagan declared the internment one of the darkest moments in U.S. history, and reparations were paid out to Japanese Americans, right? But it's a pretty long span of time. And what's really striking is that one of the parts of the Civil Liberties Act stresses specifically Japanese American education about this history, yet that's not really enforced, which is one reason why it's constantly invoked. To kind of bring it to kind of UConn's legacy here, sometimes when we hear like these histories, like these dark histories, it's a question of, well, where do we go from here? And the University of Connecticut occupies a very strange and wonderful place. So this is what I was talking about in terms of Wilbur Cross. Now remember that Japanese Americans at this time are enemies of the state. Well, the University of Connecticut was one of the few institutions that allowed Japanese American men to finish their degrees, particularly in engineering and agriculture. And unlike many other research institutions, which were reliant on military research and development, the University of Connecticut opened its arms, so to speak, to Japanese Americans. And in fact, 19 Japanese Americans graduated during this period of internment. So when we think about what is the takeaway, I would actually kind of push for the fact that even though that you might be experiencing a dark political moment, empathy, militating against indifference actually makes a difference. So thank you very much.
Our last speaker is Professor Chris Biles. He's a professor of English, and he's also the Director of American Studies.
Thank you. All right, thank you for, again, making it almost to the very end, and I'm going to add to our happy topics tonight. We're talking about fascism and its history in the United States. First of all, my interest in this subject isn't really new. In December 2014, my book on this subject came out, and basically the argument of the book, or one of the arguments of the book, is really more of a history of anti-fascism was that a Fourth Reich really is unlikely in the United States in the sense that a full-blown fascist state is unlikely to emerge in the US, but that fascist movements have existed here persistently since the 1920s and have impacted mainstream American politics in a number of very critical junctures. Now, in terms of a definition of fascism, historians of fascism have no consensus on what this term means. But one thing is interesting, that historians of fascism get very cagey about people using the word fascism to actors after 1945 or even before 1945. But one thing there is consensus on is that fascism does and did continue to exist after 1945. One historian at Oxford, Roger Griffin, wrote that as a set of political ideas, fascism could be considered more or less a permanent feature of modern political life, right? So there is found a surprising degree of consensus that it did exist after 1945. Now, identifying it is the main thing. Now, my own working definition of fascism that I kind of use is that it's a set of rightist political movements finding fullest expression in Italy and Germany from the 20s and 40s, based around militarism, a cult of the warrior, a masculinist fetish of action, anti-Marxism, and a violent, racist, and anti-democratic drive for national rebirth. Now, one of the things to note about fascism, it's a word that's familiar to most people, but it's only one of the directions that non-democracy or undemocracy can take. It's only one form of authoritarianism, even. Fascism tends to have a populist element, in that it's separated from classical conservatism or right-wing authoritarianism, and that fascism is not traditionally driven by traditional elites wishing to preserve their economic interests, but by middle-class activists animated by a highly symbolic, mythic drive for national renewal based on the aforementioned grounds. Now, this is my working definitions, and again, there is no real consensus on what the definition is. But one of the things when thinking about fascism and how it appears after 1945, one thing that's very important to separate is fascist rhetoric or fascist political speech from fascist movements and fascist parties and a fascist state. Now, to work backwards here a little bit, fascist states have been mercifully few in world history. The only ones that historians agree on with any degree of consistency are Mussolini's Italy and Hitler's Germany. There's debates, was Franco's Spain part of this? Right, and that's an important consideration. Now, when we think of fascist speech, it's important in how to identify kind of fascist words, right, is that they tend not to stress economic themes, right? Economics tends to bore fascists. Economics is a mere means to an end for fascists. And unlike many US conservatives, fascist rhetoric does not emphasize things like taxes or freedom from government, liberty, and certainly fascist speech does not follow American liberal themes like diversity, equality, inequality, tolerance, progress. Rather, fascist words tend to group around themes like nation, action, strength, power, leadership, violence, race, with very clear blacks and whites, stakes always being apocalyptic, and generally the agency behind it is male. Now, fascist movements that galvanize around such words, when I was doing my book, I wasn't really concentrating so much on fringe movements, or what the Southern Poverty Law Center calls hate groups. There's always been kind of a galaxy of these. I was more concerned with influential functional equivalents of fascism in the United States that have actually impacted the political mainstream at critical junctures. And I'm not going to walk these down. Don't really have time to do it. This could be a lecture in and of itself, but mainly just kind of keeping this up here for reference sake. Now, the question is, and that I've been asked in a number of forums too, is, well, does Trump fit the bill? Is he a fascist more, by and large? And my answer is typically goes something like this, and it's going back to that distinction between fascist words, fascist parties, and a fascist state, in the sense that Trump does hit a lot of the fascist emotional registers. He hits a lot of the key words of fascist speech. And this is why Groups like Stormfront, the KKK, the American Nazi Party are actively enthusiastic about his victory and about his candidacy, when usually they sit out the American political process and look at Democrats and Republicans and declare a proxy and go through houses. These folks were actively interested in his candidacy because of the fascist speech. That said, he doesn't actually control or command a fascist party, and it's unlikely he will need a fascist state to do what he needs to do. That said, that is not a sign that there's nothing to worry about. Now, there's more I can go on here, but as other colleagues have pointed out, there is a profound history of racial violence in this country that has not needed a fascist dictator to mediate, in the sense that there in this country, in a liberal democratic state, and not just in this one, but also in others around the world, there has been the persistence of profound racial violence, again, without authoritarian forms. And that's an entirely different kind of lecture. But that said, one of the things that's to be kind of hopeful about is that American fascist movements have been countered time and again by a very strong anti-fascist current in this country. And images of Indiana Jones are popping into my head, but also fighting fascism is also very much an American tradition. Now, the last thing to say here, to we go to the queue, is that as somebody who studies this, it's very important to remember that fascism, or anything in the ballpark of fascism, it's not a spectator sport, right? Fascism doesn't emerge or fail to emerge because of some natural mechanism of history, some natural law of history that we just kind of sit back and passively watch unfold. Fascism has to be stopped in its tracks by mass mobilization and democratic action from citizens, and this is how it's always been. There was a quote I'll leave you with from the archives that I found when I was researching an organization called the American League Against War and Fascism, which was the greatest kind of umbrella organization for anti-fascist activity in the United States in the 1930s. And there was a speaker at this convention in 1936 who had said, whether or not America goes fascist depends on who gets organized first. With those words,